All right, so today we're going to look at biological membranes. And again, at this point, we're looking at it from the totality of the cell. All right, we know that biological membranes are the first barrier, okay, a point of separation between the external environment and the internal cell. We do have some learning objectives today. First thing we want to do is evaluate the importance of membranes to the cell. Why is this membrane structure so important? It has some very important functions for the cell in terms of the cell's overall objective to maintain homeostasis, maintain this nice balanced equilibrium. Okay, the membrane plays a major role in that process. All right, we want to be able to evaluate the importance of membranes, but we also want to describe the composition of a biological membrane. Okay, and when we're describing the composition, we want to look at the components that make up this membrane. What are the components? What are the major components of a biological membrane? All right. And we'll see that structurally, we're going to find the composition is mostly lipids and proteins, right? We've talked extensively about that phospholipid molecule being a major point of structural major component of the cell membrane. So we have our phospholipids, and then we also have membrane proteins. All right, so we want to also summarize the functions of membrane proteins. All right, and then lastly, we want to describe a feature of the cell membrane as being a selectively permeable barrier, right? And so what that means is that it is going to be very selective or restrictive in terms of the substances that may be able to cross this membrane or permeate the membrane. So we have a couple of points that we'll hopefully get to today. Let's get started. So biological membranes, right? So the point that I just made is that cells must be able to maintain an appropriate internal environment in order to carry out chemical processes that are required for life, right? So again, we talked about maintaining homeostasis. We talked about things like reproduction. We talked about metabolism. We talked about a number of different chemical processes that the cell undergoes all day. All right, our cells are constantly undergoing chemical reactions and so forth. In order to maintain this appropriate environment for those things to happen the way that we want them to happen, we have to maintain an appropriate environment for that, right? And so biological membranes are at the root of that being able to happen, right? That's every cell. Okay, write this down. When we're talking about structures and distinguishing between different cell types, every single cell is going to be surrounded by a plasma membrane. Jot that down. When I ask you to compare and contrast, so when you're comparing and contrasting, you're looking at similarities and differences amongst different cells. Every single cell has a plasma membrane. Okay, every cell is surrounded by a plasma membrane. And this plasma membrane is the first barrier that separates the cell internally from the external environment. All right, we're clear about that. The next most important job, if you will, or function of the plasma membrane is to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. So let's stop here and just think about that. When we think about the cell has all types of properties that it's trying to maintain. Okay, internally, it's an aqueous environment. The external compartments of the cell, the external environment is also an aqueous environment, but the cell itself, okay, internally has a requirement for nutrients and substances and other molecules in order to maintain that appropriate internal environment. It does have a requirement for substances, nutrients and ions and so forth. So we then need to understand mechanisms for making sure that those substances can get in, the things that we need can get in but also the things that we don't want to get in, we need to make sure we keep those out. Okay. So one of the most essential functions of the cell membrane, apart from separating the cell from its external environment, is to be able to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell. So just think about your body as a whole. We have a requirement for nutrients and sustenance. We consume our foods. That's how we get our energy, right? We have things going in and we have things going out. We have a requirement for things to go out. Okay. We release our waste products. Okay. After our bodies have undergone digestion and so forth, our bodies produce urine and it produces solid waste. Okay. Feces. We have to expel those things from our bodies. Right. So the cell also has a very similar requirement for taking things in and letting out waste products. All right. So at its core, the function of the biological membrane is to separate the cell, the external from the internal, and to regulate the passage of materials into and out of the cell.
I have a question.
Absolutely.
So you know how when people like there's something wrong with their liver, so they have to have like a discharge bag on a like molecular level. Is that does that have something to do with the plasma membrane?
It may not necessarily be the membrane that's the issue. It could be just that an overall process isn't happening. Like the structures in the colon or kidney could be, like the kidney itself could be malfunctioning, or the actual processes where the urine is produced, like the gallbladder. There are a number of internal organs, right, that kind of work together. Your liver, kidney, and all of those work in concert, kind of. So to answer your question, it may not just be one thing that is the reason for that person needing a bag. It was called a colposcopy or something like that, or I forget what it's, a catheter and a cath bag. Like it could be a number of reasons why. It's not just like a cell membrane issue. It's more so going to be probably a malfunction of the actual organ.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay, yeah. So, right. So the process in which our bodies produce urine and waste, bile, there are a number of players in that. So there can be a number of abnormalities that contributes to a person needing to have a bag. That's the short answer. All right. So at the cellular level, when we're talking about the regulation of passages, we're talking about the substances and nutrients that need to get in at the cellular level. So like the things like the glucose and other like sodium ions and other minerals and so forth that need to get into the cell so that the cell itself can function properly. That's at the cellular level. That's what we're looking at here when we're talking about the membrane. All right. Good question. So we're saying here that the cell must maintain okay, we talked about that already. All right, so biological membranes. Let's look at the composition, the makeup. That term composition is referring to the structural makeup of the cell membrane. All right, biological membranes are a complex structure that's made mostly of lipids and protein molecules. Go ahead and jot that down. Okay, it's a complex structure that's made up of lipids and proteins. Okay, we know that that lipid in particular is the phospholipid. We've talked about the arrangement of that phospholipid into a two-layer phospholipid bilayer, right? But what we haven't talked a whole lot about are the proteins that protrude from that phospholipid bilayer. So there are protein molecules that are performing many different functions at the cell membrane level. All right, so let's look at a few of the many vital functions of proteins that may be present in the cell membrane. So if you go into your browser and you pull up any different image of a cell membrane, if you just type in cell membrane, you're going to see a structure that contains lipids and proteins in different arrangements, okay? Lipids and proteins are going to be present in the cell membrane. So what are some of the functions of these proteins? We're clear that they regulate the passage of materials, right? And this is necessary because not all substances that the cell needs will be able to just easily, move across that membrane, right? Because that membrane is a barrier, right? But we know that it's not like a static structure that where things cannot move through it. So it's not like a wall, like a solid wall where nothing can get past this wall. What it is that it's actually a fluid structure, or kind of a semi-solid, if you will, and the arrangements of those phospholipids in that bilayer does allow for the passage of certain substances through those phospholipids. Okay, so this surface, this plasma membrane, is not completely impenetrable apart from these proteins being present, right? So we do use the term selectively permeable because certain things can pass, and they can pass by various mechanisms. Now, gases like oxygen and so forth can actually penetrate that membrane very easily unassisted, okay? Those gases can diffuse across the membrane pretty easily. Water is another substance that can easily penetrate that membrane without too much assistance, doesn't require any energy. You've heard of the term osmosis. We'll get to that in just a moment. However, other larger complex molecules do require assistance, if you will, to get past that membrane. And that's where our proteins come into play. Okay, I think we may have briefly mentioned how proteins that are embedded in our membranes can function as channels or openings to allow for the passage of these larger, more complex molecules to get into the cell. Okay, so they function as openings. Okay, so we're saying that proteins can regulate the passage of materials into the cell. They can also serve as a surface for chemical reactions, right? So there's signaling that goes on at the level of the cell membrane. And I do have some schematics or pictures that I'll show you in a moment. But I want you to jot these functions down. Regulate the passage of materials. The proteins at the cell membrane serve as a surface for chemical reactions to take place. So we're looking at receptors and ligand activity. The proteins that are in the cell membrane also serve as a means for cells to, can you please mute your mic? Proteins in the cell membrane also serve as a means for cells to adhere with other cells. So we know that cell-cell adhesion is basically how we get the formation of tissues. And then proteins in the cell membrane serve as a way to transmit signals between the environment and the inside of the cell. So again, when we talk about the requirements that a cell has, there's signaling between the environment and the cell in order to make sure that the proper transfer of nutrients and ions and molecules are taking place. So signal transduction is important. So let's look real quick. We have a few more moments. Let's take a look here at the structure of this membrane. All right, I've used the term phospholipid bilayer. Go ahead and jot that down real quick if you haven't done so before. All right, the cell membrane consists of a fluid bilayer structure of phospholipids. And so when we say bilayer, that prefix bi means two. So we're talking about two layers of phospholipids, right? This phospholipid bilayer right here, this is a basic illustration of a phospholipid bilayer. All right, we have a layer of phospholipids here, and then we have a layer of phospholipids here. All right, and so these two layers of phospholipids form a continuous barrier around the cell. Okay, if you turn your eyes over to this illustration over here in your right hand corner, we have a 3D illustration of what this cell membrane looks like. We have the phospholipid molecule. We've talked about it already. We've got that hydrophilic head and these hydrophobic tails. This right here is one phospholipid. All right. The phospholipid bilayer is just an assembly of phospholipids. All right. If we look at a three-dimensional illustration of that, we have this continuous barrier of phospholipids arranged in this bilayer sheet formation, where we now have this 3D barrier, 3D illustration of this barrier around the cell. So it's not one-dimensional. All right. And so we have our polar heads on the outside. So this is the part that's going to interact with the external environment from the cell, which is an aqueous environment, right? So we have our polar heads out here, polar hydrophilic heads. And then we have also our heads in the aqueous environment inside of the cell. So this is inside of the cell, which is an aqueous environment or water. And then we have the outside of the cell, which is also a water environment. And then what we have tucked away in here in that bilayer formation are our hydrophobic tails. All right. So the cell membrane, when you are asked to describe the structure of the cell membrane, you're telling me that it is sort of this fluid mosaic structure of a bilayer of phospholipids. It is not static, it is fluid, which means that it's not impenetrable. Things can pass through it. So these arrangements of the phospholipids, there's going to be some degree of passage through this assembly. So gases and non-polar substances can pass through pretty easily, with water being an exception of a polar substance that can move through. So the phospholipid, I like you to write down this term amphipathic. The phospholipid is an amphipathic molecule, and it is characteristic of having both a hydrophilic and hydrophobic component. Okay, that's what that term amphipathic is referring to. Phospholipids characteristically are amphipathic. That's a unique molecule, because typically, you know, a substance or a molecule is hydrophilic or it's hydrophobic. But in this case, we see a special characteristic where this one molecule shares both properties. It has both a hydrophilic and a hydrophobic component. Okay. And this is typical of the phospholipid. Okay. And so our bodies are mostly made up of water. So when you're thinking about the interactions of the cell, this formation of this cell membrane with these phospholipids makes sense. And the arrangement of this phospholipid bilayer makes sense. Again, when you think about our bodies internally are mostly made up of water. So we got these hydrophobic heads on the outside of this plasma membrane, but we also know that inside of the cell is also an aqueous environment. So we have our hydrophilic heads facing our internal compartment as well. So this arrangement of the phospholipid bilayer makes sense. The hydrophilic head makes contact with water, while the hydrophobic tails are buried on the interior of the structure away from water. These are our hydrophobic tails right here. All right. And it is the hydrophobic tails that are contributing to the selective permeability of this membrane. Okay. So do understand that piece. All right. So we talked a little bit about those membrane proteins. All right. So the cell membrane, we're clear now. Structurally, it is a phospholipid bilayer with proteins embedded. Okay. Those proteins have some very important roles in cellular activity. Right. So we talked about regulating the passage of materials. So the proteins serve as a point of being able to transport materials into the cell. Okay, we talked about communication and signal transduction. So yes, the proteins play a role in transmitting information from the external environment to the internal environment. We said that the cells on that membrane facilitates cell-cell contact. Okay, so the connection of cells to other cells, and we know that we need that in order for tissue formation to occur. Right, we looked at those levels of biological levels of organization, and we know that cells interact together to form tissues. All right, so that adherence or adhesion between cells are important, and proteins help facilitate that process. All right, real quick, let's look at two types of membrane proteins, and we'll stop here today. Two major classes of proteins are defined by how tightly they are associated with the lipid bilayer. So I mentioned before, if you just did any quick Google search of a cell membrane, you're going to see this lipid bilayer, right, with proteins embedded throughout. Okay, and so depending on where and how these proteins are embedded in the membrane, we can define them as either integral or peripheral. Okay, two major classes of proteins depending on how tightly they associate with that lipid bilayer. All right, integral proteins and peripheral proteins. Okay, by definition, integral proteins are firmly bound to the membrane. Okay, if you look at this illustration here, this integral protein can extend in and out of the cell. So we're going all the way through this lipid bilayer. Okay, by definition, an integral protein, in order to release it, we would essentially disrupt the integrity of this membrane. We would disrupt that bilayer. Structurally, integral proteins are firmly bound to this membrane. They extend both inward and out of the cell. So from the intercellular side and extracellular side, we're going to see evidence of this integral membrane protein. And just think, if you try to remove this integral protein just based on how it's arranged in this membrane, you are going to disrupt the integrity of that membrane. Okay, so removal of an integral protein would require the disrupting of that bilayer. That is not a good thing. Okay, and so we sometimes refer to integral proteins as transmembrane proteins. Okay, they extend all the way throughout that membrane. This is another example of it, of a integral protein or a transmembrane protein. They extend all the way throughout the membrane. Now, in contrast, we have peripheral membrane proteins that by definition are not embedded into the lipid bilayer. Jot that down. All right. So you have peripheral proteins here that are in close association with that membrane, but they are not embedded in that lipid bilayer. Okay. They're typically located on the inner or outer surfaces of the membrane, but they are not embedded throughout. They do not span the entire length of that membrane. Okay, so peripheral proteins are going to be in association with the membrane, yes, but they're not firmly embedded. Okay, integral proteins are. I'm going to stop here so we don't run out of time. I want to give you a minute to ask any questions that you may have. What questions do you have so far about